Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 54: Origin and Doctrine of the Paulicians. The story of the Paulicians begins not in the courts of emperors, but in the rugged mountains and borderlands of Armenia and Eastern Asia Minor, regions where imperial authority was weak, and where the religious landscape had long been shaped by a confusing blend of ancient heresies, Eastern mysticism, and the formal doctrines of the Greek Church. It is in this remote and restless frontier that the sect first took form, and where its early leaders, fueled by a desire to return to what they imagined to be the purity of apostolic Christianity, set in motion a movement that would for centuries trouble the Church and Empire of Byzantium. The founder traditionally associated with the Paulicians was Constantine of Menelaus, a man of humble birth who adopted the name Silvanus after one of the companions of St. Paul. The choice was deliberate. Constantine believed that the faith of the apostles had been corrupted by centuries of ritual, hierarchy, and superstition. The ornate ceremonial and philosophical complexity of the Byzantine Church seemed to him a betrayal of the simple and spiritual religion preached by Paul. Thus, armed only with the New Testament, especially the epistles of his chosen apostle, he began preaching a doctrine that rejected icons, relics, the intercession of saints, and the ceremonial weight of the priesthood. He proclaimed that the visible church had fallen into error, and that only a return to the scriptures, interpreted with unadorned clarity, could save the faithful. The Paulicians' critique struck at the heart of Byzantine religious identity. The empire had long defended its icons and its hierarchical clergy against both internal dissent and external threat. To question these institutions was not merely to challenge doctrine, it was to challenge imperial order. Yet in the remote provinces where Constantine preached, his ideas found eager listeners, particularly among peasants, soldiers, and border communities who had long felt neglected by the increasingly bureaucratic Church of Constantinople. Over time, small congregations arose, each named after an apostolic city, as if to recreate in Asia Minor a spiritual map of the early Christian world: Corinth, Philippi, Antioch, and others. The Paulicians did not build churches, they met in homes or in the open. They rejected the sign of the cross, dismissed the sacraments as empty rituals, and viewed the clergy of the Orthodox Church as corrupters of the gospel. Their simplicity, discipline, and zeal drew converts despite the growing hostility of the authorities. Inevitably, the empire intervened. Constantine was arrested and executed, but his death only kindled greater fervor. A Byzantine general named Simeon was sent to suppress the sect, but, moved by the steadfastness and serenity of the Paulicians he persecuted, he converted and adopted the name Titus. For this act of defiance, he too was executed. Persecution scattered the Paulicians but did not destroy them. They withdrew deeper into the mountains and villages of the East, sustained by a sense of spiritual mission and by the memory of their martyrs. A period of confusion followed under a leader named Banes, whose behavior earned condemnation even within the sect and threatened to corrupt its moral foundation. It was during this dark moment that the movement found its greatest reformer, Sergius, a man of remarkable endurance and intellectual vigor. For more than 3 decades, Sergius traveled from village to village, preaching, teaching, and restoring order to the scattered communities. Under his guidance, the politicians regained discipline and purpose. He is remembered as the second founder of the sect, the man who gave it coherence and unity at a time when it might otherwise have fractured. Despite the efforts of Sergius, the Byzantine authorities continued to view the politicians as heretics and rebels. The Empress Irene, zealous in her orthodoxy, ordered mass executions. Whole villages were destroyed, thousands were slain or forcibly relocated. Yet it was persecution itself that pushed the politicians to adopt a more militant stance. Many fled eastward into territory controlled by Muslim princes, who welcomed them as refugees and potential allies. In this new environment, shaped by constant warfare along the frontier, the politicians transformed from a religious community into a military force. This transformation found its center in Tefrese, a fortified stronghold perched upon the mountains of eastern Asia Minor. Under the leadership of men like Carbeas and later Chrysochirus, the politicians began launching raids into Byzantine territory. Their knowledge of the land, combined with the discipline they had inherited from decades of persecution, made them formidable opponents. What had once been a spiritual rebellion now became a political and military threat to the empire. The politicians fought with the fury of a people who had no home but their faith and no refuge but their fortress. They forged alliances with the Arabs, raided imperial cities, and inflicted several humiliating defeats upon Byzantine armies. Tefrese became both a symbol of their resistance and a wound in the pride of the empire. For decades, successive emperors failed to eradicate the politician enclave. It was not until the rise of Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty, that the empire mounted a decisive campaign. Basil, determined to restore imperial authority in the east, launched an assault that eventually overwhelmed Tefrese and shattered its defenses. The stronghold was destroyed, its inhabitants killed or scattered. Yet Basil did not annihilate the sect. Rather, he resettled many surviving politicians in Thrace, using them as a buffer population against the Bulgarians. In this new homeland, they continued to practice their faith, though increasingly diluted by contact with neighboring peoples. Over time, the remnants of the politicians blended into the cultural and religious landscape of the Balkans. Their doctrines did not vanish. They resurfaced in new forms, inspiring later movements such as the Bogomils in Bulgaria and, further west, the Cathars of southern France. These later sects, though distinct, inherited from the politicians a spirit of protest against ecclesiastical hierarchy, a suspicion of clergy and ritual, and a desire for spiritual purity. Thus, the chapter presents the politicians not merely as heretics, but as the embodiment of an enduring pattern in religious history, the rise of movements that seek to strip faith of its ceremonial trappings and return to a perceived original simplicity, and the violent reactions such movements provoke from institutions. Their story is a cycle of faith, persecution, resilience, and transformation. Though the fortress of Tefrese fell, the ideas that had been nurtured there did not perish. They wandered across centuries and continents, shaping the spiritual undercurrents of medieval Europe. In conclusion, the politicians stand as a reminder of the tension between authority and conscience, between institutional religion and the yearning for direct communion with the divine. Their journey from obscure villages in Armenia to the battlefields of Asia Minor and finally into the fabric of European descent illustrates the unpredictable paths by which ideas, once born in hardship, can outlive the empires that sought to extinguish them. Chapter 55. The Bulgarians, the Hungarians, and the Russians. In this chapter, the historian surveys the rise of three formidable nations, Bulgarians, Hungarians, and Russians, whose appearance on the frontiers of the Eastern Empire reshaped the political map of Europe. They emerged not as fleeting marauders, but as enduring powers, each born of a distinct mixture of geography, character, and circumstance. Together, they illustrate the gradual shift of strength from the Mediterranean world to the forests, plains, and river valleys of the north. Their ascent marks one of the great turning points in European history, when the heirs of Rome found themselves contending with new forces whose names had scarcely been known a few centuries earlier. The Bulgarians appear first. Their origins trace to the steppes north of the Black Sea, where Turkic horsemen mingled with the Slavic tribes who had long settled in the Balkans. This fusion produced a bold and resilient people, able to endure the rigors of nomadic life while also adopting agriculture and permanent settlement. Their arrival in the Danubian regions coincided with a period of profound weakness in the Byzantine Empire. Exhausted by wars with Arabs and Persians and harassed by internal intrigues, Constantinople lacked both the energy and the resources to repel a well-organized invasion across the Danube. What began as scattered incursions soon solidified into the foundations of a kingdom. Bulgarian chieftains imposed order on the Slavic tribes, adopted fortified positions, and learned the arts of both diplomacy and war. From their strongholds, they confronted the empire with a tenacity that proved far more dangerous than the transient raids of earlier barbarians. More than once, the armies of Byzantium were forced into humiliating retreats. The emperors alternated between paying tribute, launching fruitless offensives, or courting alliances in hopes of interrupting the growth of their northern rival. Yet the tide eventually turned under the stern leadership of Basil II, whose iron discipline restored the military prestige of Byzantium. His long war against Bulgaria was a test of endurance rather than genius. Year after year, his armies advanced, besieged, and subdued. Victory was sealed by one of the most brutal acts recorded in medieval warfare: the blinding of nearly the entire Bulgarian army captured in a decisive engagement. The psychological force of this horror crushed the spirit of the Bulgarians, and their king is said to have died of despair upon witnessing the mutilated remnants of his troops. Once their independence collapsed, Bulgaria became part of the empire. Yet their identity persisted, and in later centuries they would rise again as a cultural and political force. Next, the historian turns to the Hungarians, a people whose sudden appearance on the plains of Europe terrified all who encountered them. Unlike the Bulgarians, who built their power gradually, the Hungarians burst upon the continent with the ferocity of a thunderstorm. Originating from the vast steppe east of the Carpathians, they possessed the unmatched mobility of nomadic cavalry. Their arrows, loosed from horseback at full gallop, created panic among the heavy infantry of the West. Neither Italy, Germany, nor France escaped their ravages. Towns were burned, churches pillaged, and armies routed in the blink of an eye. The Hungarians were driven not only by the search for plunder, but by pressure from other nomadic peoples advancing from the east. Their migration into the Carpathian Basin marked a turning point. Here, surrounded by fertile lands and defensible borders, they made the transition from wandering horsemen to a settled nation. Contact with Christian missionaries, traders, and princes slowly altered their character. Over time, their wild ferocity softened into political stability. Under the reign of leaders who recognized the strength that came from adopting Western institutions, they converted to Christianity, organized a feudal monarchy, and emerged as a powerful state. Byzantium, alternating between hostility and alliance, found in them at times a dangerous foe and at other times a necessary buffer against more distant threats. Finally, the chapter reaches the Russians, whose early history is wrapped in the mist of legend, but whose later influence is unmistakable. The ancestors of the Russians were Slavic tribes scattered across an immense expanse of forest and marshland, loosely organized and often divided by local rivalries. It was not until the arrival of the Varangians, Scandinavian adventurers skilled in trade and war, that these tribes began to coalesce into political entities. The Varangians, known in the West for their voyages across the Atlantic, turned their attention eastward and established control along the great rivers that flow to the Baltic and Black Seas. Under leaders such as Rurik and Oleg, they built fortified settlements and created trade networks that linked northern forests with the riches of Byzantium. The attraction of Constantinople was irresistible. Russian fleets repeatedly descended upon the imperial capital, sometimes as merchants, sometimes as raiders. Their attacks were violent and sudden, but their admiration for the splendor of the empire was deep. Over time, commercial treaties replaced warfare, and cultural contact increased. Russian princes traveled to Constantinople. Byzantine missionaries traveled northward. Amid this growing exchange came the most important transformation in Russian history, their conversion to Christianity. The baptism of Prince Vladimir, celebrated with magnificence in Kiev, bound Russia to the spiritual and cultural orbit of Byzantium. The Orthodox faith provided not only a religion, but a script, a literature, and a worldview. Churches rose along the riverbanks, the liturgy, sung in the Slavic tongue,
fostered a sense of unity among disparate tribes. Yet even as religion softened their manners, the Russians remained formidable warriors. Their soldiers, recruited from vast rural populations, could march great distances and endure harsh conditions with stoic endurance. They served both as allies and mercenaries in the Byzantine armies, proving their worth in many campaigns. What unites these three narratives, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Russian, is the gradual displacement of the old Mediterranean order by emerging northern powers. As the Roman legacy decayed and the Byzantine Empire grew increasingly strained, new nations filled the vacuum. They brought with them not merely war, but new religions, institutions, and identities. The Bulgarians challenged and then absorbed Byzantine influence. The Hungarians terrorized Europe before being transformed by Christianity. The Russians, though born outside the bounds of Rome, would one day become heirs to the Eastern Empire in ways no one of the 11th century could have foreseen. Gibbon's concluding reflection suggests that the rise of these peoples was not an accident, but part of the broader ebb and flow of civilization. As one center of power weakens, another strengthens. As old institutions ossify, new societies, vigorous and unencumbered, move into prominence. The frontier tribes that once seemed insignificant would become the new arbiters of Europe's destiny. Thus, Chapter 55 presents a portrait of transformation, the decline of ancient power, and the ascent of new nations who through war, adaptation, and ambition forged their place in the grand narrative of the medieval world.
Chapter 56. The Saracens, the Franks, and the Normans. The history of Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries unfolds as a turbulent contest among three very different powers, the Saracens, the Franks, and the Normans, each shaped by distinct ideals, ambitions, and methods of warfare. Their encounters transformed the political and religious landscape of the peninsula and exposed the progressive weakness of both the papacy and the Byzantine Empire. In this chapter, the historian observes not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of civilizations, each bringing its own temperament and spirit to the struggle for the central Mediterranean. The Saracens, arriving from the coasts of North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, were the first to impose themselves decisively upon southern Italy and Sicily. These warriors came in swift fleets, guided by the winds of the Mediterranean and an enthusiasm that was as much religious as martial. The faltering authority of Byzantium offered them an opening, and their early raids soon gave way to more systematic conquests. Sicily, once a jewel of Greek and Roman civilization, gradually succumbed to their perseverance. City after city, Palermo, Messina, Syracuse, fell before their arms, and the island was transformed into a prosperous Muslim emirate. The Saracens fortified their strongholds, organized administration with remarkable efficiency, and turned Sicily into a base from which to strike the Italian mainland. Their incursions into southern Italy sowed terror among the coastal populations. Bari, Taranto, and other towns endured repeated attacks. Villages were plundered and monasteries reduced to ashes. In the boldest of these expeditions, Saracen raiders even reached Rome itself, desecrating the suburbs and lighting fires on the hills surrounding the Eternal City. Such events deeply wounded Christian pride and spurred new alliances. Yet, the Saracens did not hold the peninsula by force alone. They exploited the rivalry between local princes, hired themselves as mercenaries, and navigated the chaos of Italy with shrewd political instincts. It was in response to these dangers that the Franks reappeared in Italian affairs, though not with the unified strength that had once accompanied Charlemagne's armies. After the Carolingian Empire splintered, Frankish power was exercised through regional kings and ambitious nobles rather than a single sovereign. Even so, their intervention was decisive. At the call of the papacy, ever in need of a protector, they marched into Italy to confront both the Saracens and the disorder among the Italian princes themselves. Their heavy cavalry, encased in armor and trained for shock combat, offered a contrast to the agile raids of the Saracen horsemen. Yet the Franks came not as disinterested saviors. Each leader sought profit, land, or the approval of Rome.
Their presence complicated rather than resolved Italy's internal disputes. Frankish dukes quarreled over territory, alliances formed and dissolved, and the papacy, desperate to secure a reliable patron, often found that Frankish aid came at the cost of political independence. Still, despite their flaws, the Franks helped check Saracen expansion and forced the emirates of southern Italy into retreat. Their military and religious unity, however imperfect, offered resistance where the Italian states alone could provide none.
But the most formidable and unexpected power emerged last, the Normans. These warriors, descended from the Vikings who had settled in northern France, arrived in Italy initially as pilgrims and mercenaries. Their sharp instincts sensed that the fractured politics of Italy offered an arena rich in opportunity. Though few in number, they possessed qualities that made them natural conquerors: individual bravery, relentless ambition, and an ability to impose discipline upon themselves when led by a strong commander. At first, the Normans sold their swords to the highest bidder, sometimes the Byzantines, sometimes the Lombards, and occasionally even Saracen rulers. But gradually they turned from servants to masters. The leaders of the Norman clans, William Ironarm, Drogo, Humphrey, and above all Robert Guiscard, forged a disciplined fighting force that soon eclipsed all native rivals. Their tactical genius lay not only in their personal courage, but in their willingness to adapt. They learned siegecraft from Byzantines, cavalry techniques from Franks, and naval methods from the Italians. The rise of Robert Guiscard marks the dramatic turning point in Norman ascendancy. His ambition matched his military talent. From a modest adventurer, he grew into a prince who challenged empires. Under his leadership, the Normans drove the Byzantines from Apulia and Calabria, seized their fortresses, and carved out a principality that recognized no superior. Guiscard's campaigns displayed energy and imagination unrivaled among his contemporaries. He defeated Byzantine armies, humbled local lords, and even contemplated the conquest of Constantinople itself. His invasion of the Balkans, though ultimately repelled, sent shockwaves through the Eastern Empire and proved how far the Normans had risen above their origins. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the Normans confronted the Saracens in a prolonged struggle that combined diplomacy, siegecraft, and daring assaults. Roger, the brother of Guiscard, gradually expelled Muslim rulers and annexed the island. Yet, in a notable departure from the brutality of the age, Norman Sicily became a realm where Latin, Greek, and Arab cultures interacted in a remarkable synthesis. It was an island where mosques stood alongside churches, where Arabic scholars served Norman princes, and where the legacy of three civilizations blended into an unusual harmony. Throughout these conflicts, the Byzantine Empire appears as a fading shadow of its former self, still proud, still skilled in diplomacy, but lacking the strength to reclaim what had been lost. Its garrisons in Italy were isolated, its officers divided, and its emperors preoccupied with distant threats. The empire's inability to preserve its Italian dominions was one of the clearest signs of its long decline. The papacy, too, emerges in the chapter as both actor and instrument. Seeking protection from Saracens and Italian nobles alike, the popes at various times embraced Frankish and Norman support. But reliance on foreign powers came at a price. The papacy, while gaining military security, risked entanglement in secular ambitions. The Normans especially became both saviors and overlords of Rome, shaping their fortunes long after the immediate crises had passed. In the end, the chapter reveals a profound transformation. Italy, once the heart of the Roman world, had become a battleground for outside forces. The Saracens brought the vigor of Islam. The Franks represented the evolving chivalric order of the West. The Normans embodied the restless energy of the North. Their encounters remade the political order of the central Mediterranean. Sicily passed from Greek to Saracen to Norman hands. Southern Italy, once Byzantine, became Norman, and the papacy, caught between danger and opportunity, helped legitimize the rise of new powers.
Chapter 56 thus presents a story of transition, of the old Mediterranean world giving way to the emerging medieval West. In the Normans especially, Gibbon sees the actors who would shape the next centuries, bold, adaptable, and irresistible. Their victories over Saracens and Byzantines alike signaled the dawn of a new political and military order in Europe.
Chapter 57. The Turks. The history of the Turks, as presented in this chapter, unfolds like the long march of a people destined to reshape the ancient world. It begins far from the centers of civilization, in the immense grasslands of Central Asia, where nomadic tribes wandered with their herds and lived by the bow. For centuries, they were little more than vague names in distant chronicles, restless riders beyond the frontiers of China and Persia. Yet from these obscure beginnings emerged a nation that would one day dominate the Islamic world, seize the heartland of Asia Minor, and bring the Eastern Empire to the brink of destruction. The earliest Turks were molded by the harshness of their environment. The open plain was their homeland. Endurance, frugality, and mobility were their virtues. Their horses were their constant companions, and in the saddle they found the speed and agility that made them fearsome opponents. Unlike the settled peoples of the Near East, the Turks recognized no fixed boundaries, no solid walls of stone, only the horizon and the need to survive. But the force that propelled them into history was not mere hunger or wandering instinct. It was the gradual expansion of tribes that grew from scattered families into confederations powerful enough to sweep across continents. The empire of the Seljuks, the first great Turkish power in the Muslim world, began with a clan that embraced Islam and transformed itself from a group of steppe warriors into a disciplined force answering the call of faith and ambition. The figure who first raised them to prominence was Togrul Beg. Moving westward into Persia, Togrul found a fragmented land. The once mighty Abbasid Caliphate had become a shadow of its former grandeur, divided among local warlords and incapable of defending its capital. With a mixture of military skill and statesmanship, Togrul restored order, subdued petty rulers, and marched on Baghdad. There he received the title of Sultan, the secular arm of the Caliph, who retained spiritual authority but ceded temporal power to his Turkish protector. This alliance between the Caliph and the Seljuks marked a turning point in Islamic history. The Turks, once strangers to the faith, became its champions, yet in doing so, they altered the balance of power within the Muslim world. The Caliph stood at the summit of religious hierarchy, but the Seljuk sultans controlled the armies, taxes, and provinces. Gibbon views this shift with an eye trained on irony and inevitability. The guardianship of Islam had passed to men whose ancestors had known neither the Prophet nor the Quran. After Togrul, the Seljuks reached new heights under Alp Arslan, the warrior sultan celebrated for both courage and magnanimity. It was he who directed Turkish ambitions toward the Byzantine frontier. The Armenians fell first. Then the great plateau of Anatolia became the battleground between the Eastern Empire and the rising Turkish power. In describing Alp Arslan, the narrative highlights his decisiveness and the discipline of his troops, qualities that contrasted with the political weakness and internal discord of the Byzantines. The climax of the chapter, and indeed one of the decisive moments in medieval history, is the Battle of Manzikert. Here, Alp Arslan confronted Emperor Romanus Diogenes, a brave but ill-supported sovereign whose army was undermined by treachery and incompetence. The defeat was catastrophic. Romanus was captured, his empire's eastern defenses collapsed, and Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantium, lay open to Turkish occupation. Gibbon dwells with admiration on the Sultan's conduct. Alp Arslan treated the captured emperor with a chivalry rare in that age, granting him generous terms before releasing him. Yet noble gestures could not undo the fate of the empire. Turkish tribes poured into Anatolia, settling the fertile plains, founding cities, and turning the region into the nucleus of the future Turkish states. After Alp Arslan came Melik Shah, under whose reign the Seljuk Empire attained its greatest splendor. His rule extended from the Oxus to the Mediterranean and brought an era of prosperity and relative tranquility.
Much of this success is attributed to the genius of his vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, whose administrative reforms created schools, strengthened justice, and guided the empire with wisdom and restraint. While Melik Shah reigned, the Seljuk seemed poised to create a durable and enlightened dominion. Yet the Seljuk Empire was not built on secure foundations. Like many states formed by nomadic conquerors, it depended heavily on the personal authority of its rulers. When Melik Shah died, his heirs fell into rivalry. Princes battled with their uncles, generals deserted their posts, and the once unified empire fractured into small sultanates in Persia, Syria, and Anatolia. This swift decay is described with the historian's characteristic melancholy. The grandeur of a generation could not survive the ambition of those who inherited it. Even in decline, however, the Turks remained formidable. Their occupation of Anatolia had permanently altered the geography of power between East and West. No longer was the Byzantine Empire able to draw on the manpower and resources of its eastern provinces. The loss of these lands weakened the empire economically, militarily, and spiritually. It was a blow from which Byzantium would never fully recover. More importantly, Turkish control of the Holy Land and the pilgrimage routes set the stage for the First Crusade. Reports, often exaggerated, of the harsh treatment of Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem spread through Europe. The Seljuks, though not uniquely cruel, ruled with a stern military efficiency that made little allowance for foreign sentiment. Thus, the seeds of conflict grew from the collision of Turkish expansion and Christian devotion. While the Turks were distracted by internal conflict, the Latin West mobilized in a religious frenzy. The Crusaders would arrive as both liberators and conquerors, further complicating the fortunes of the Seljuk states. Though Gibbon narrates these events with a clear sense of their drama, he also notes the deeper patterns at work. The Turks embodied the recurring phenomenon of nomadic tribes rising to prominence, seizing established empires, and then, over time, losing the vigor that had carried them to victory. Yet their legacy endured. Their settlement in Anatolia laid the groundwork for future Turkish states, including the Ottoman Empire, which would rise centuries later to eclipse both the Seljuks and the Byzantiums. Chapter 57 thus portrays the Turks as a people whose arrival reshaped the medieval world. From obscure origins, they emerged as conquerors, patrons of Islamic learning, and ultimately architects of a new political order stretching across Asia and into Europe. Their story, marked by triumph, decline, and lasting influence, forms one of the central arcs of medieval history. A dramatic example of how the migrations of a hardy frontier people could redirect the course of civilizations.
Chapter 58. The First Crusade. The First Crusade stands as one of the most astonishing eruptions of collective emotion in the history of Europe. A movement neither planned by kings nor guided by seasoned generals, but awakened in the hearts of ordinary men and women by a mixture of religious fervor, fear, and hope. In this chapter, the historian traces the origins, progress, and triumph of the Crusaders who, against all expectations, marched across continents and seized Jerusalem from the hands of the Turks. It is a tale not of order, but of impulse, not of diplomacy, but of faith. A movement whose very excesses reveal the strange union of devotion and violence that shaped the medieval mind. The story begins with the plight of the Byzantine Empire, weakened after the disastrous Battle of Manzikert. Most of Asia Minor, once the empire's military heartland, had been lost to Turkish tribes. The countryside was ravaged, frontier cities fell one after another, and Constantinople stood isolated between hostile forces. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, aware that he could no longer defend his dominions alone, appealed to the West for aid. His call for help, carried across the seas, arrived at a moment when Western Christianity itself was in turmoil. Knights quarreled incessantly, nobles defied kings, and the Church sought to elevate its spiritual authority over secular lords. Into this atmosphere stepped Pope Urban II, a man of energy and vision. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, he delivered a sermon that resounded through Christendom. He spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians, the desecration of holy places, and the indignities endured by pilgrims in Jerusalem. Whether the details were exaggerated hardly mattered. What the crowd heard was the cry of God calling them to arms. With a fervor that stunned even Urban, the multitude answered, Deus vult, God wills it. Thus began not merely a military expedition, but a social whirlwind. Before the princes of Europe had even organized their forces, a mass of peasants, beggars, and wandering zealots surged toward the east under self-appointed leaders, the most famous of whom was Peter the Hermit. This People's Crusade, driven by unreasoned enthusiasm, degenerated quickly into disorder, violence, and tragedy. They plundered towns on their way, provoked hostility in Hungary and the Balkans, and were ultimately slaughtered by the Turks in Asia Minor. Their deaths served as a grim prelude to the more disciplined armies that followed. The true crusading force was composed of European nobility, warriors accustomed to hardship and skilled in combat. Among them were Godfrey of Bouillon, noble and steadfast, Raymond of Toulouse, wealthy and devout, Bohemond of Termonto, cunning and ambitious, and Tancred, courageous and chivalrous. Although united under the banner of the cross, each prince carried his own hopes of glory, conquest, or salvation. Their alliances were uneasy, their rivalries constant, yet the necessity of survival bound them together. Crossing into Asia Minor, the Crusaders captured Nicaea, then confronted the Seljuk Turks at Dorylaeum, where the speed of Turkish horsemen nearly annihilated their forces. But the heavy cavalry of the West held its ground, and the Turks withdrew. This victory emboldened the Crusaders as they pressed deeper into lands ravaged by war and barren of supplies. Hunger, thirst, and disease tormented them. The march through Anatolia and towards Syria became a test not only of arms, but of endurance. Their next great obstacle was Antioch, a fortress city whose massive walls seemed invincible. The siege dragged on for months, during which famine reduced the Crusaders to desperate measures. Yet persistence and treachery opened the gates. A disaffected guard allowed the Crusaders to scale the walls under cover of darkness. The capture of Antioch, however, instantly turned into a new crisis when a vast Muslim army arrived to relieve the city. For days, the Crusaders were trapped between starvation within and the enemy without. In this darkest hour, visions and relics, most famously the supposed discovery of the Holy Lance, rekindled their morale. Renewed by fervor as much as by necessity, they charged and defeated the relieving army, securing Antioch as a Christian stronghold. Though many expected the expedition to dissolve after this victory, the Crusaders pressed onward toward Jerusalem, now the central symbol of their quest. The journey south exposed them once more to thirst and hardship, but the sight of the holy city revived their courage. Jerusalem was defended by determined forces and encircled by formidable walls. The Crusaders, lacking sufficient siege equipment or supplies, turned to desperate innovation, constructing towers, ladders, and engines from whatever materials they could gather. The assault was fierce, and their success owed as much to persistence as to strategy. When the walls were finally breached in July 1099, the Crusaders poured into the city. What followed was slaughter. The historian does not hide the grim truth. In their frenzy, the Crusaders killed Muslims and Jews alike, filling the streets with blood. This violence was justified in their minds as divine vengeance, yet it stands as a stain upon the triumph they claimed in God's name. And yet, from this chaos emerged a new political order. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen to rule Jerusalem, not as king, for he refused a crown of gold where Christ had worn one of thorns, but as defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Other Crusader states took form in Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, each ruled by a Latin noble. The success of the First Crusade astonished contemporaries and historians alike. It was achieved without centralized command, without imperial support, and in the face of immense difficulties. Its armies were plagued by internal disputes. Its supply lines were non-existent. Its route passed through hostile lands, and its opponents, though divided, were formidable. Yet the Crusaders prevailed, driven by faith, ambition, and a sense of providence that transformed ordinary men into instruments of history. The chapter concludes with the reflection that the First Crusade was both heroic and tragic, a monument to human devotion and human brutality.
It opened 2 centuries of conflict between East and West, reshaped the political geography of the Near East, and left a legacy that would echo through medieval Europe. Its victories were fleeting, yet the memory of its fervor and violence lingered long after the Crusader kingdoms themselves faded into dust.